Hello. Well, this weekend we come to the middle of the Advent season. In fact, as we have mentioned perhaps earlier, this is the one year in which there are 4 full weeks of the Advent time. So this Sunday has the name of being Gaudete Sunday, namely a Sunday to rejoice. One isn't quite sure whether we're rejoicing that we're halfway through and like the glass that's half full, how do you look at it? But it is a Sunday to remember, once again, that this is a special season within the liturgical year as we prepare to look for the coming of the Lord. The readings this time, the first reading comes from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 35, verses 1 through 6a, and then verse 10. The second reading comes from the letter of James, chapter 5, verses 7 through 10. And the gospel is from Matthew, chapter 11, verses 2 through 11. Now, you will remember that our guide throughout these 2 weeks of the Advent season, namely the second and third week of Advent, is centered around, or our guide is, John the Baptist, or as I mentioned last time, John the Dipper, the one who, down in the banks of the Jordan, as groups had come to him from the southern part of Israel, namely from Jerusalem and Judea, had been baptized by him in a baptism of repentance. And John had pointed out that there will come one after me whose sandals I am not worthy to bear. So, and in fact, as we will notice, there's a certain connection that's going to be made with this week's reading between the dress of John as well as the message of John. Now this week, we jump to chapter 11, in which we find that John is in prison. Now, where this prison is, we believe that it was a prison at Machias that had been developed by Herod Antipas, who was the ruler, you remember, of the Galilean of Perea. And the story is, although this is not mentioned, that John had threatened in some way Herod, and he had him imprisoned. Now, this place where he was imprisoned was a fortress, by the way, of Herod Antipas or Antipas. And Herod had built a number of these places throughout Palestine. Often they were winter residences. He tended to move around. But the prison, now we're not quite sure what kind of a prison this was. Some of the prisons that we pictured them are like we see them today, above ground, and people are behind bars. But prisons in those days often were underground pits, and the prisoner would live underground, and then, of course, they couldn't climb out of this pit, so it was pretty safe that they would not be able to get away. However, whatever the situation is, John is able to receive visitors. So some disciples of John come to him to see him. We're not quite sure what message they were bringing, or perhaps they were bringing news of what this Jesus was doing. Keep in mind that there is a distance between the time in which the Baptist was at the Jordan baptizing and now the time that he is pictured as being arrested. You had to read in Matthew chapter 4, and there's a skipping around here to make the message of John clearer, that Herod had John arrested. Now, whether the charge was the same as as Mark had pictured, that it was for the sake of his relationship with Herodias, the former wife of his brother Philip, we're not sure. We do get the word from Josephus, who was, of course, the Hebrew historian, tells us that he had been arrested for other reasons, namely that Herod had seen John as a possible threat to starting some kind of rebellion, and that, of course, was something that Herod wanted to make sure did not happen, because the Roman rulers would be disturbed by such a thing. Anyway, when the disciples of John come to see him, he asks them to go and ask Jesus who he is. Is he the promised one who is to come, or is he to look for another? Now, interestingly, how is this question phrased? And sometimes I point out that tones of voice can make a great difference. Now, is he just asking an academic question? Are you the coming one? What if you ask it a little more cynically? Are you the coming one? And there might be a kind of overtone to that, because the things that John had been hearing about Jesus did not exactly fit the idea of the prophet, of the one whom God was sending. So, John had, you remember earlier on, recognized Jesus and pointed him out to the crowds as the coming one. So now why is he asking this question? Because perhaps the things that he has heard about Jesus do not match the understanding of a Messiah that John had in mind. And therefore, he really wants to find out from Jesus himself how he understands his own mission and his own message. So that's the setting, you see, in which this little gospel passage this time is set. Now, when they report to Jesus, so these same visitors who had come to John now come to Jesus and ask this question, Jesus responds by saying, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard." And he makes some quotes from the prophet Isaiah. In fact, some would see, and that's why the first reading this time is given us, that in chapter 35 of Isaiah, he makes mention about the fact that in the Messianic age, the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the poor will have the good message delivered to them. Interestingly, and that's why remember that as what we're looking at, things in our discussions here are not necessarily the way in which we will make our homilies or our message this weekend, because this whole background about the Baptist is a little bit more controversial than at first it would appear. After all, and we've mentioned this before and we need to mention it again, what exactly was the nature of the Messiah that those who were expecting a Messiah wanted or hoped for or did expect? Keep in mind, as we've mentioned a number of times, not everyone was looking for a Messiah. That's more a Christian interpretation that we will hear, and it's understandable, that the whole world of Israel was expecting a Messiah. Not really the case. The expectation of a Messiah in Jesus' time was hoped for by certain groups, but not by every Hebrew, not by every Jewish community. And that's important to respect, the understanding of the time. However, what kind of Messiah were they looking for if one were to come? Keep in mind that Jesus, when he gives a report back to John's disciples to tell him does not match the thinking that perhaps the Baptist had. One might keep in mind that there was an expectation that the Messiah, what he would be like when he came, could be found in what were important works that are not in our New Testament, but which were popular in the first century world, known as the Psalms of Solomon, particularly the 17th and 18th Psalms. They were composed in the first century, before the common time. That would be a few years before Jesus came, in Jerusalem, and they contain an unusually sharp portrayal of the Messiah as a future descendant of David, who will be first and foremost a military leader. So you see, if there was an expectation of what the Messiah would be like, and he would be one, this comes from these writings, who would purge and renew Israel as his worldly kingdom. Thus, he would restore this ruler the real kind of images that would have been found in the days of King David. Namely, this man will rule over Israel. He will purge Jerusalem of the Gentile conquerors. He will gather a holy people and judge the 12 tribes, and he will restore the tribal boundaries of Israel. So you see, this would be one expectation of what a Messiah would be all about. He certainly would be, according to these reflections, a righteous king who would avoid the errors and mistakes committed by the kings of the past, and that he would be relying well on God to help him make the most important decisions for Israel. Indeed, according to this message, it would be a day of a mercy that would be a day of blessing. Now, so I mention all of this because when we think, everyone was expecting a Messiah fitting a certain pattern or understanding, that was not the case. So, when, therefore, the word has to go back to John, what kind of Messiah is this? It probably did not fit the understanding that John had. John's idea of Messiah might have been closer to that of the vision found in the Psalms of Solomon than it was to what was actually happening. What was happening? Keep in mind now we're in Matthew's Gospel. We've moved from the very beginning, chapter 3, to now verse 11. So a number of things have happened in Matthew's Gospel. Namely, there have been basically healings of various kinds, messages of various kinds, that did not necessarily fit the pattern that the Baptist had had. So all of that lies behind the question of the Baptist to Jesus, are you the one who is to come, or shall we wait for another? What would be that another that others might be waiting for? Now, Jesus, as we have mentioned, tells the disciples, go back and tell the things that I have done to John, so that he may perhaps come to understand that if indeed he is able to accept Jesus as the Messiah, as the promised one, it will not fit a pattern that perhaps he had been more accustomed to understanding or accepting. So, the little section we heard this week from Matthew's Gospel does fall into two parts. What we have been talking about is part 1 here, where the question is being raised to Jesus by the disciples of John, or John himself through his disciples, and the response that Jesus gives them. Part 2 takes place after the disciples of John have left, and Jesus says, talking talks about the Baptist, about John. Now, as we hear this, keep in mind, looking at this from kind of putting all the evidence that we have together of what was the understanding and thinking going on at the time, that his praise, he is pictured as praising John, but it is somewhat ambiguous. See, now when we homilize in this, we'll take away from the ambiguity. But if one listens carefully to what Jesus says here, can see that he's not absolutely acclaiming the rightness of John's position. Certainly he holds John up as a true prophet. You remember that the prophets of Israel were fearless in their proclamation. They were wholly dedicated to their message. And he praises John for that the message that John had and the message that he believed in was one for which he was willing to stand courageously, and that might well have resulted in his being arrested by Herod. On the other hand, Jesus is respectfully but firmly putting into his place the Baptist. Now, what did you go out to the wilderness to see? Jesus says with regard to the Baptist. Did you go out to see a reed shaken by the wind? Now that's an interesting image. Reeds, as you remember, were tall, hollow grasses, probably growing in the shallows around the River Jordan. So that would be maybe one of the allusions that he is making. Did you go out to see John, or did you go out to see the reeds? Okay, so you get a contrast between John, who remains unbending as a prophet, and the reeds which flow with the wind. There's another analogy here that the reeds may have. There were coins minted under Herod Antipas on the occasion of the founding of the city of Tiberias in the year 19. Tiberias is, as you know, a city on the Sea of Galilee that Herod Antipas had decided to build and named it Caesarea. After, of course, the Caesar, he had hoped that it might be a place that visitors would come. The Sea of Galilee is a very nice place, and that their visitors might come. But when he struck the coins for the occasion, there was a reed on it. See, so the reed here may have been an allusion, very carefully here brought into play, to Herod Antipas. Did you go out to see someone, says Jesus, clothed in soft garments? Well, this may well have been a reference to the fact that in the courts, certainly of Herod, people wore soft garments. But remember last time how John was garbed. He was garbed in leather cloth with a rag cloth rather, with a leather belt around him, an allusion to the great prophet Elijah. So that was camel's hair and a leather belt. So a tough figure of a prophet. See, once again, what did you go out to see? If you wanted to see soft courtiers, well, you knew where you could find that. But if you went out to find a true prophet, then that's who John was. So there's a lot of allusions here that Matthew, who is always very careful of Old Testament images, as we've mentioned, sees this. And later on, at the very end of this little section, Jesus is pictured as saying, if you are willing to accept it, John is the Elijah to come. And that's where the whole setting of Elijah was. Remember, he had been taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot, and one of the theories was that when the Messianic ages would come, Elijah would return and be the announcer of this new time, of this new kingdom. So when the allusion is made that John is the Elijah in flesh, you can see how this is all connected with his, therefore, being the precursor for the coming of Jesus. So, does Jesus, therefore, and when he is referring to the Baptist, affirm that his works are indeed the works of the Messiah, and therefore that he is indeed the one who is to come? Or does Jesus suggest that even though his works may differ from those of the expected Messiah, he is nonetheless the one who is to come? So, if Jesus to John affirms that his works are those of the Messiah, then the background for his claim likely fits Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, which is the reading from Isaiah, part of it, that is chosen for this week. The only little difficulty here with this is that Isaiah does not mention a Messiah. He really rather mentions a coming time. Now, this certainly could be messianic, and it's fair enough to make that interpretation, but again, there's a little bit of readjusting on the part of Christian thinking here with regard to the Baptist. Now, also it concludes, and this is where the ambiguity a little bit lies, that as great a prophet as John was, one who accepts Jesus is greater. Now, what is the role of John as a prophet? Is he, as some would interpret it, the last of the great Hebrew prophets, although there had been none for a number of times, and therefore he fits the prophetic style, and he certainly does, not only by dress, but also by word, by calling people to conversion of heart, to renewal? Or is the Baptist the precursor of Jesus? Is he the one who indeed exercises the role of inviting those who would come to hear him to turn to Jesus, to listen to Jesus' ways? Or does the Baptist stand as a unique figure? In a certain way, he doesn't belong to the Old Testament, but in another way, he doesn't belong to the New Testament. He really has nothing to do with, ultimately, the saving works of Jesus, namely his passion, death, and resurrection. And so by that time, unfortunately, John had been executed and was not around for the actual inauguration on the part of Jesus of the new kingdom. So there lies the ambiguity with regard to the Baptist. Now, our Christian interpretation of him, I smile and say, well, he is the one who precursors Jesus, and that's how we honor him, not only this time, but throughout the history. But we're not quite sure what the widespread understanding of Messiah was in Jesus' time. I mention this because, and we have mentioned this before, messianic expectation could have been, and popular in different quarters, but certainly there was not a universal expectation in Jesus' time that a Messiah would be coming. That's what makes Jesus' mission, that's what makes Jesus' message really unique and important. So all of that, as we remember the Baptist this time in response of Jesus, it's important. Just to finish this part off, is John the precursor, reminds one of the words of the prophet Malachi. Now, Malachi is an Old Testament prophet, and when the books of the Old Testament were rearranged on the part of Christians, put the book of the prophet Malachi as last. Therefore, as the last work in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament before the beginning of the New Testament, which would be the Gospel of Matthew. But what is important here is that Malachi says that there will come one before me who will announce the good news of the kingdom. I will send you, says Malachi, here are the words, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. So Malachi suggests that, and here's what we mentioned a few moments ago, that Elijah might certainly be equated with John in his time. But notice that the prophet Malachi's thought or thinking would match that of John. This great and terrible day, what's going to happen? When those who are the wronged, who are ruling, who are the evil ones will be put in their place, and this new and just kingdom of God will take place. So you can see the contrast here, and that's where we'll leave this part of the episode between Jesus and John, the contrast between their vision of who the Messiah and what the Messiah would be doing. We're more familiar certainly with Jesus' message, but we can see that for its time, it certainly was a little bit challenging. A word or two about the second reading, which comes from a letter attributed to James. Now, there are a number of Jameses mentioned in the New Testament, as you know. Certainly two of the disciples of Jesus, James and John. We also are told in the Acts of the Apostles that James, who most likely was a relative of Jesus, therefore maybe not one of these disciples, was the head of the church in Jerusalem. But the little section that we hear this week from James's letter, a letter attributed to James, speaks about patience, the importance of being patient. And again, patient for what? In waiting for the coming of the Lord. Because when this letter was written, he had not come perhaps as quickly as been expected. And James argues that it's important to be watchful, to be waiting. Skip to the fact that he uses an analogy from farming. He says that if you are a farmer, you know how you have to wait for things. First of all, you have to wait that the early rains do their job. Now, the early rains in Israel come between October and begin rather in October or November. They hit the parched ground and get the earth ready for seeding. Then there are the early spring rains, which come anywhere between